This is Professor Engelhardt, and we are continuing our series on the principles of macroeconomics by looking at the Keynesian perspective of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Now, remember that the two big questions that aggregate supply and aggregate demand are used for is to first help us to explain what causes business cycles, these economic fluctuations that we go through seemingly year after year. Sometimes times are good, sometimes times are bad. So, what makes that happen? And then a second question would be is what can we do, if anything, to stabilize the business cycle? Specifically, it'd be nice to not have these bad times. So is there something we can do about that? So in this video, we're going to be looking at the Keynesian perspective. Specifically, we'll look at aggregate supply and aggregate demand in a purely Keynesian analysis. We'll look some at the theoretical basis of the Keynesian system, so how it is that John Maynard Keynes and those that followed him would justify their view. Then we'll take just a quick look at the so-called Phillips curve, which was discovered by Phillips, looking at the relationship between unemployment and inflation. And then finally, we'll take a look at the view of Keynes and markets and how that relates to government policy. So when it comes to aggregate supply, this is where Keynes's view that there are basically two worlds or modes that the economy can be in really shines through. And that is that Keynes believed that, on the one hand, sometimes the economy is in a state of full employment. That is, where anybody who wants to find work can find work, right? You might have some level of unemployment out there, but it's really just people between jobs. The jobs are out there, they just need to find them. Right? Now, in a state of full employment, what aggregate supply looks like in the Keynesian system is that it's perfectly vertical, which means that at higher price levels, we can't produce anymore. We're operating at capacity at this point. Full employment, that's at capacity. So there really is no room to increase real GDP. So the only thing then that aggregate demand can impact, at least if it increases, is that it will just drive up prices. That's it. There's no room for it to have any kind of stimulative impact there. However, if we're in a depression, that is, where employment is below the full level, in that case, we're in a world of sticky prices. So that is a really key component to Keynes's view, is that prices are sticky downward. Right? So if demand falls, then we're not going to see prices fall. Instead, all that's going to fall is production. So if we're in depression mode, so we're at this stuck price level, then aggregate demand shifts are only going to impact the level of production or GDP. They're not going to have any impact on prices as long as we are within that range. So we really have two pieces of aggregate supply curve. One piece is horizontal, that is when we're in depression. The other piece is vertical. So put them together, and they look something like this. Right, so we have the recessionary or depression range, and then we have the inflationary range. And then we can drop an aggregate demand curve along here anywhere we like, and we can then figure out what is going to happen. Now, one thing that's important to remember is that because prices are sticky downward, if we actually move our aggregate demand curve, so we move vertically up the vertical part of the aggregate supply curve, that horizontal portion will also move upward because prices are sticky downward, right? So they can't like fall back down. So you're not actually going to be at a point where you can decrease aggregate demand and just see a drop in prices. That's not something that is going to be there in the Keynesian system. Right, so then aggregate demand is really the emphasis of Keynesianism. Keynes very much believed that what causes depressions is a lack of effective demand, is what he called it, or aggregate demand in our current language. So he really thinks that a shift in aggregate demand is the main reason we see business cycles happen, that sometimes aggregate demand collapses, and this then leads to depressions. Right, so aggregate demand, remember, is based on this expenditure-based view. It's all about how much spending people do, and specifically in those four key components of consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. So first, what are influences on consumption? So there are basically four or five influences on consumption that will have an impact on what aggregate demand looks like. So one is your level of disposable income. So this will be affected, for example, by tax rates. Right? So if tax rates fall, then my level of disposable income is just increased because less of my money is going toward taxation, right? So in that case, an increase in disposable income, I'm going to want to consume more. Also, expectations about future income have an impact. So, just as a simple example, right, even before I get a raise or even before I get a promotion, if I expect it coming, I will often go ahead and, at least partially, spend that new money before I receive it. This is just something that we do. And so, if people on the whole are very optimistic about their future incomes, we'll tend to see an increase in consumption. Also, wealth itself has an effect. So if, say, the stock market's doing really well and a lot of people own stocks, then we're going to see people consuming more. As we now feel wealthier, we feel like we can go out and consume. In addition, the availability of credit can play a big role. Right? So if we move from a system where it's very difficult to get credit, so I think about, say, how much of the world operated, say, before the year 1900, yeah, the credit was there, but very few people used it on a regular basis. In that case, um, it's going to dampen your consumption. On the other hand, once credit becomes widely available, so that now I think it's fair to say that in the United States, the grand majority of people have credit cards, for example, then that is going to increase our ability to consume and we'll tend to see more consumption. Now, another thing that relates to this would be a change in savings rates, that is, how much of your income you tend to save. And this is something that can happen, we would just use the term autonomously, that is, that you can just decide, like, well, I'm just not going to save as much as before, or I'm going to save more than before. As you have this change then in your savings rate, that is going to have an influence on consumption as well. Turning then to investment and what affects that, it's really going to be three things. So, first is your level of expected profits. If people expect a lot of profit in the future, they're going to be willing to invest in building capital, in buying machinery, and so on, in building houses today, if you think that whatever the thing is you're investing in is going to pay off. Right? So high expected profits will tend to lead to high investment. This ties then with this idea of confidence. Right? So if you're really confident about the future of your business, you're going to be much more likely to invest in that business to purchase the types of goods we would consider to be investment goods. So again, machinery, factories, and the like. Now, this idea of confidence ties to a key element in Keynesian theory. That is what we call animal spirits. So Keynes uses this analogy. He says, think about a school of fish. And we know that schools of fish exhibit what we call herd behavior. That is to say, if you watch a school of fish, I kind of enjoy going to the aquarium. Right? So you go to the aquarium, you watch the school of fish. What do they do? Right? They're all kind of swimming the same direction. And then something startles them, or perhaps nothing startles them, and they very quickly change direction. And that is very much the way that Keynes saw investor psychology, because he believed that investors acted very much like schools of fish. That is, that when times start to be good, we start feeling very good, and we kind of catch this from each other, right? So investment goes up because we have a lot of investors that feel very confident about the future. But then once they start getting skittish, they tend to all turn at the same time. So investment then in the Keynesian system tends to be a big source of instability in the economy, as simply for psychological reasons, we see people becoming really confident and excited, and then really not confident and depressed. And that depression leads then to an economic depression. The third factor would be interest rates and what we call the marginal efficiency of capital. Right, so the marginal efficiency of capital is the question of how much return can you get from investing in a piece of capital. And what Keynes suggests is that investors are going to look at that marginal efficiency of capital and compare it to the interest rate. So if the interest rate is pretty high, then a lot of investments aren't going to be paying enough for it to be worthwhile to invest in that capital. So they're not going to. So high interest rates, we're not going to invest so much. On the other hand, if you lower the interest rate, people are going to be much more willing to invest, in effect, because lots of different projects are going to pay off where they wouldn't have paid off if the interest rate was higher. Now, government spending. So when we look at government spending, this is something that's really just determined by policy, right? So it's up to the government to decide, right? How much do they want to spend? how much they want to tax. And that's that. Right, so the tax decisions are we know are going to have an impact on consumption through the process of disposable income changing, and spending itself is going to have a direct impact through that G of government purchases. Now, this last element, so things that influence net exports. Now, here we can really think of two main factors. The first one would be economic growth of your economy relative to other economies, right? So if, say, our economy is growing really fast, then what's going to happen is that because we have so much wealth in our economy, we're going to buy a lot of goods from abroad. So that means imports are going to be high. At the same time, if other economies aren't growing very much, then they're not going to be buying our exports, so exports will be low. So the result is, if we have very high economic growth, then we're going to have lower net exports, or it might be more negative or at least less positive. So that'd be one factor. On the other hand, if our economy is growing relatively slowly, the opposite will be true. That is, we're not going to be importing much, we'll be exporting a lot because the rest of the world is growing quickly, so we'll see higher net exports. The next effect would be price level relative to others. So if our economy has unusually high prices compared to other economies, then what we're going to see is relatively low net exports. If American goods are expensive, Americans aren't going to buy American goods. We're going to import from abroad. And if American goods are expensive, others aren't going to buy American goods, so we're not going to be exporting much either. So imports will be high, exports will be low, but another way, net exports will be low if we have an unusually high price level compared to other economies. So now let's get to the theoretical basis. Right, so what are the key components of the Keynesian theory that then lead to the conclusions that come from it? The first component would be the stickiness of wages. Now, this is an argument that John Maynard Keynes makes in his General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, where he suggests that wages in particular are sticky downward, mostly for a couple reasons. One being that at the time that he was writing, he thought that unions would play a significant role, and you have collective bargaining agreements where wages are in effect stuck for the length of that agreement. You also have the fact of I'm just convention that conventionally we don't cut people's wages. So there's kind of this social aspect to it. He also suggested there's a coordination problem, and that even if, say, every worker would be perfectly happy to take a pay cut, nonetheless, that doesn't mean any individual worker is going to be happy to take the pay cut, right? So yes, if everybody takes the cut of, say, 10% in our income, we may be willing to go along with that. On the other hand, if you cut my income 10% and nobody else's, then I'm real mad, and that's really, really bad for morale and productivity. Right? So you have this coordination problem that can arise with relative wages. So all of these are reasons we may not see wages being able to move downward. Right? So then, if demand collapses, well, we can't lower people's wages, so we have to get rid of them. Another point would be about sticky prices. Now, sticky prices are something where Keynes just kind of assumed it was true. It was later generations of Keynesians that then kind of fleshed out why this might be true. And they specifically pointed to something they call menu costs. Right? So menu costs, it's actually kind of what it sounds like. That is, anytime a restaurant wants to change their prices, they have to print new menus. And there's a cost involved with printing new menus, which means then you're not going to be changing your prices constantly, right? Instead, you're only going to change them occasionally. So sometimes, right, your prices are not going to be the prices that will bring about equilibrium, right? So this is the type of argument we can apply and why it is that prices would not move very quickly. So it's expensive to change prices, so we're just going to kind of let them be where they are. And then the last one is just an assumption about aggregate demand being really important. And this really comes from Keynes's mind believing that in the end, businesses are responding right to consumer demand. So if consumer demand collapses, businesses will respond by not producing as much. Now, another key component of the um, Keynesian perspective is what we call the expenditure multiplier. So the expenditure multiplier, or sometimes it's just called the multiplier, is based on this idea. That is, that there's some level of what we call autonomous spending. So the autonomous spending is spending that is not based on any increase in income. right? So imagine for a moment that you lost your job, and so your income drops to zero. How much would you spend? Now, very few people can afford to spend nothing, at least not for long. Why? Well, we need some place to live. We need to eat. We need to keep the lights on. Right? These types of things, that we have things we're going to continue to spend money on, even if our income is zero, at least for a while. We're going to continue spending money on these things. So this would be the level of autonomous spending. Now, any spending we do beyond that is based on the fact that we do have an income. Right. So what ends up happening then is that when you have this autonomous spending, even if that's all you have, that is going to spark additional rounds of consumption spending. Because what happens? If I spend money on, say, food, that money appears as the food producer's income. Then they have that money, which then will spark them to go out and spend that money. And then as they spend it, that appears as somebody else's income and they go out and spend it and so on. So we get this ripple effect that occurs. Now, it might be that I change my autonomous spending, right? So I might possibly increase my autonomous spending for whatever reason. If that happens, then this is a new drop that drops into the pond, setting up a new set of ripple effects. Now, the amount of ripple effects we get depends on what we call the marginal propensity to consume, or the MPC. The marginal propensity to consume is just a number that we give. It's the amount of an increase in income you get that you decide then to spend, right? So your marginal propensity to consume might be 60%, which means for every extra dollar you earn, you're going to go out and spend 60% of that, or 60 cents. You'll save the other 40 cents of that. Now, this is different from your average propensity to consume. Your average propensity to consume is what proportion of your income total, right, do you spend? So this is a little bit different because it might very well be, and is often the case, especially as your income goes up, your average propensity to consume is higher than your marginal propensity to consume. Right? So say if I'm relatively wealthy, give me another dollar, I'm probably going to save a good chunk of it, even though I'm spending the grand majority of my income. Right? Okay, so let's go ahead and show how this MPC works in terms of creating a ripple effect. Right, so let's say that in the first round, what happens is that somebody decides they're going to go out and spend $100. So this $100 shows up then as somebody else's income. Now, the person that gets this $100 of income, now they have $100 of income they previously did not have. Assuming a marginal propensity to consume of 70% or zero point 0.7, they say, oh, this is great. I have $100. I'm going to go out and spend 70 of that. Well, as they spend that 70 appears as somebody else's income. Right, so now we have $100 from the first round of additional income plus $70 of additional income from the second round. Of course, that $70 that just got spent is somebody else's income. So they take that $70, they say, oh, this is fantastic. I'm going to spend 70% of this. That's $49. So now we have a third round of spending. And then we can keep going round after round after round. So in this case, that $100 of original spending actually turns into $253 at the end of 4 rounds. Now, we don't want to stop here, though, because the fourth round is not the last round. That's $34 of income that somebody else gets. They're going to go out and spend it, right? So we can continue with this infinitely until we have an infinitely small amount of money that is then changing hands, right? So we can actually figure out how this is going to end up. And here it is. So what the multiplier is equal to, it's the total change, right, in real GDP divided by the change in that round one spending. So that $100, right, of additional spending, what does that change into in terms of total, right, real GDP? So after many, many rounds, what you'll end up with is the multiplier is equal to 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So in this case, if the marginal propensity to consume was zero point 0.7, 1 divided by 1 minus zero point 0.7, 1 minus zero point 0.7 is 0.3. 1 divided by zero point 0.3 gives you 3.33, and then technically the 3 repeats. So that means, under these conditions, one additional dollar of autonomous spending leads to a total of $3.33 of additional GDP. Now, I will say real quick, this has a huge impact in how we think about government policy, right? So one of the forms of autonomous spending is government spending. So if you want to stimulate the economy in the Keynesian framework, say this is our multiplier. If I want there to be an extra $333 million of GDP, the government doesn't have to spend $333 million. Instead, it spends $100 million. That 100 million shows up as someone else's income. They spend part of it. That what they've spent shows up as someone else's income, and so on and so forth, until we end up with a total of 3.3 times the original 100 million, or 333 million. So let's talk about the Phillips curve. Right, so we mentioned the aggregate supply curve in Keynes's original theory. That is, where it's perfectly flat up to whatever our potential GDP is, which is the actual capacity, full employment, and there it's perfectly vertical at that point. So the reality is this probably isn't true. It's just probably not true. Most likely, there's something else happening here. That is, there's going to be a trade-off, right, between production and prices. Now, one way that we can see this is through something called the Phillips curve. So the Phillips curve was discovered by Phillips by looking at, they looked at UK data, I believe it was in the 1950s, if I recall, and then they looked at the US data around the same time, actually just the next decade after that. And what they found is there's this relationship, right, between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate, which is exactly the kind of relationship we might expect if aggregate demand really matters. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at it. Right, so this is what the data looks like for the United States from 1960 to 1969. So each point here shows a combination of an inflation rate and an unemployment rate that was observed within that decade of the 1960s. One thing you can see here, I mean, it looks like if you played connect the dots with these, you would have a beautiful, right, curved line. There are only a couple of points that are slightly off of it. So this shows then something that feels like what you would expect with a Keynesian-ish um, aggregate supply curve. Right? Right. So if we happen to be in a state, right, where we have very high unemployment, so we're to the bottom right here, we increase the inflation rate a bit. What happens? We see a big drop in the unemployment rate. On the other hand, when the unemployment rate gets fairly low, in this case under about 4% or so, then we see these big increases in inflation that really don't seem to decrease unemployment whatsoever. So it's very much like there's a vertical portion and a horizontal portion, maybe not perfectly so. You can see there is some curvature here, right, of this relationship, which is the close, right, to what would be expected by Keynes. So this is considered to be reasonable evidence that this Keynesian story of the shape of the aggregate supply curve is close to true, just a little bit more extreme than is actually true, and also that it would be aggregate demand that is really the real story, because aggregate demand, when it shifts, it's going to mean that we have an increase in output along with an increase in prices. Just turn that into unemployment, we have an increase in inflation with a decrease in unemployment. On the other hand, the other way goes. So decrease in aggregate demand, that's going to drop prices, in this case, lower inflation, but at the same time, output falls, so unemployment gets worse. So this is exactly what we expect to happen if we have a demand-driven macroeconomy and something that looks not far from this aggregate supply curve suggested by Keynes. Oh no, what happened? Then we move into the 1970s, 1970 to 1979, and you look for the relationship. I can't find it anymore. So there's something goofy going on here. And that goofy thing is that in the 1970s, there were significant supply shocks, is kind of the way the story goes, is that the economy stopped acting the way that Keynes suggested. It's not aggregate demand based anymore. Instead, we start seeing supply move around at times. And if supply is moving around, we're going to see a different relationship between prices and unemployment than what we saw previous to that point. Right? So this is kind of the evidence that happened in the 1970s, where economists started to rethink the Keynesian paradigm and saying, well, is this really something that is universally accurate? It worked really, really well during the 1960s. During the 1970s, not as well. Right? So there's the sense that something had to be fixed here. So this is what kind of the perspective was, and that is that maybe what's going on here is that the Phillips curve, it can shift over time. So the way that this typically is explained in economic theory is that it sh it shifts based on changes in inflation expectations. Right? So as, say, you expect higher rates of inflation, that's going to lead the Phillips curve to move vertically upward. On the other hand, if you expect lower rates of inflation, that's going to the um, lead the Phillips curve to move vertically downward. So as people's inflation expectations change, we're going to see a vertical upward and downward shift in that Phillips curve. And so then this would potentially explain what's happening. So if we have something like the 1960s, people generally expected very little inflation to happen most of the time, right? So any inflation that happened was kind of a surprise within that time frame. By the 1970s, things had changed, right? People started to see that inflation was something that happened, it was something they paid more attention to, it was something they were more aware of, that it could change, and as a result, they changed their expectations much more rapidly. So we saw the Phillips curve move around a lot, according to this view. And because the Phillips curve is moving around a lot, we don't actually see the Phillips curve if we try to plot these points, because those points are from different Phillips curves, right? So you're not going to be able to just connect them to see what the Phillips curve looks like anymore. Now, that is the typical explanation. Now, I'm going to say, unofficially, this isn't necessarily true. And the evidence of this is when you look more recently, say in the decade of the 19 of not the 19s of the 2010s. When you look in the decade of the 2010s, inflation expectations when we do these surveys are quite stable. But at the same time, the Phillips curve still doesn't look stable. This suggests that there's something else going on. It might just be that the Phillips curve is just not predictable enough to be useful in the economy that we have now. So here's just a little bit of the data about that. So here are the points for 2010 to 2019. If you take a look at that, I don't see anything that looks like a Phillips curve here. If anything, it might have a roughly U or V shape to it. It does not obviously look like a Phillips curve. And like even if we were to connect these for like consecutive years, it would not look like, well, here we had a Phillips curve for a few years and then it shifted over here or something like that. We don't see that type of thing happening. So let's look at Keynes and his policy prescriptions. Now, I think it's fair to say that Keynes, a lot of the reason that he was writing the way that he was writing was to convince politicians to change the way they thought about economic policy. That is, he wanted people to think about the short run. As he said very famously, in the long run, we're all dead. So he wanted politicians to think about the short run and what the short run looked like. And when the economy is bad, he wanted politicians to feel like they should, in fact, do something rather than just wait for it to get better. I think that is really a big part of Keynes's motivation and why he theorized the way that he did. Right. So fiscal policy then is the thing that he focused on is government spending and taxing policy. He really thought this would be the effective way that we could treat the economy to try to get it out of the doldrums, out of a depression or a recession. Right? So he says, let's actively use taxation and spending to create stability in the economy. So if we're finding that we have significant inflation, that's a sign that aggregate demand is growing too quickly. So fiscal policy needs to be more contractionary. We need to try to prevent aggregate demand from rising. How do we do that? We cut government spending, that directly has an impact on G, and we also increase taxes. That's going to have an impact on consumption as people don't have as much money to spend. Right? So increase taxes, decrease government spending, that'll help us fight inflation. On the other hand, if we're in a recession or a depression, then we need expansionary fiscal policy. We need to expand aggregate demand. How do we do that? You decrease taxes so people have money to spend. That should increase consumption, and government just spends directly, right? So buy stuff. And we saw this happen in, say, the Great Depression in the United States, where we saw things like the Civilian Conservation Corps or the Works Progress Administration and the like, where all of these were designed right, to increase government spending in the face of that depression. Now, Keynesians will also talk about something we call automatic stabilizers. Now, the purpose of an automatic stabilizer is to automate this process. Sounds right, right? Right. So things like, for example, welfare spending. If you have a welfare program in place, what happens? The economy is going well, government spending will fall on welfare. Fewer people are on it when the economy is good. right? So there's this natural thing as the economy improves, government spending tends to tamp down. So you have this natural contractionary policy that comes from from the way welfare works. On the other hand, if the economy gets bad, then more people see really low incomes, more people go into the welfare system. As the welfare system grows, the economy, the government spending is going to increase, but the increase in government spending will help to stabilize the economy, right? So we have an automatic increase in spending during the recession through the welfare system. Income taxes actually act very much the same way, right? If people are really doing well, the economy is great, incomes are going up, income taxes start going up. So that means there's an automatic drain on the increase in income that prevents it from rising quite as fast. So if we're tamping down the increase in aggregate demand. But it also works in reverse, right? So as incomes fall in a recession, right, we collect less in income taxes, which then, in effect, is going to dampen that decrease. So your income is not falling quite as fast as it seems because, hey, at least you don't have to pay taxes on the income you didn't earn. This then brings me to one of the last topics, and that is Keynes's view of markets and how markets should relate to government. So Keynes took the view that markets work quite well for individual markets, right? So if you're looking at, say, the market for tires, Keynes is inclined to say this is perfectly fine. We don't need to have, right, a bunch of government intervention in deciding how the market for tires should work, right? Or the market for corn, or the market for notebooks, or the market for tablets. Uh, we don't need the government getting into all of these markets individually. However, Keynes also took the view that the aggregate issues were such that markets didn't solve them very well because of the overall price stickiness that he saw and because of the overall wage stickiness that he saw. He said, well, these are not problems that the market will fix themselves. So that's where the government should step in, right, to use fiscal policy to manage the business cycle, but it should not step in to micromanage the economy. Right? So, for example, John Maynard Keynes actually opposed the minimum wage, which is kind of surprising to some people. However, while he, on the one hand, opposed the minimum wage, he didn't think that this individual market for labor was something that government should get involved with. They shouldn't be setting prices like that. At the same time, right, Keynes was very supportive of government work programs. Right? So, yes, the government should step in and provide jobs to people in the case that the economy is not doing very well. Right? So, it's this kind of, in many ways, Keynes is often described as kind of a middle of the road type of policy, where on the one hand, he does believe in markets to some extent, but on the other hand, he believes that they are significantly flawed when it comes to dealing with macroeconomic issues. So, just backing up then to make a point about kind of government policy from this perspective. Now, there are a number of questions that arise when we think about fiscal policy's effectiveness. So, things like should we engage in spending or should we engage in tax cuts? Which is going to be the more effective way to stimulate the economy? Now, if you look at just what are the effects through the multiplier, it actually turns out that government spending would be considered more effective. But there are other effects as well, besides just what it looks like on a multiplier. There's also the question of, well, how can we tell, right, how much potential GDP is? After all, potential GDP within the Keynesian perspective is kind of a hard limit. Once we hit that point, we don't want to go beyond it because we're not actually going to be able to go beyond it. We're just going to get inflation. We don't want that to happen, right? So, no, being able to figure that out is really, really important if we're going to try to be managing the economy to hit that level. And then there's also just the practical question of, given the fact that Congress takes a while to act, right, is fiscal policy going to be fast enough to make any difference? And this is actually an additional argument for automatic stabilizers rather than having there being a kind of a conscious direct hand from fiscal policy. Let's set up a bunch of policies that will automatically stabilize things to some degree. So there's the question of speed, right? Will government act fast enough, right, to really make any difference? Now, these are questions that we will be picking up again when we look at the neoclassical perspective, as some of these are really where the neoclassicals would tend to disagree with Keynes and the Keynesians and would suggest that an active role for government may in fact be more destructive than helpful. But more on that in another video.